This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Harpan, and my guest today is a professor of European history at Brown University. He is the author of a forthcoming book entitled Anatomy of Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz. He is now in Israel to participate in an international workshop organized by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Van Leer Institute entitled Nationalism in the History of the Holocaust, Genocide and Mass Violence. Professor Omer Bartov, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So let's start with a methodological question, because your book is a resolute defense of personal testimonies as a source of historical inquiry, which is quite an unusual stance for scholars in your field who adhere to documents and archival evidence as the bedrock of their profession. How would you make the case for using testimonies as such?
Well, before I make the case, I should say that the book is not a resolute defense of testimonies. The book is based on numerous types of documentation. It's based on documents from over 50 archives in 9 countries and in 9 languages. However, I also use a large number of testimonies and other types of personal accounts, diaries, letters, judicial reports, trials, and so forth. To my mind, if we want to understand what genocide is about, and my book is ultimately an attempt to create an anatomy of genocide, to understand genocide, we need to understand how people perpetrated it and how people experienced it. And if we rely only on official documents, we end up having only one side of the story, which is usually the side of the perpetrators. Victims of genocide rarely have time to have documents. They usually are too busy trying to survive, and most of them do not. So that's the point of view that I brought to the book and to the idea of trying to reconstruct genocide, particularly in a specific place. I would say beyond that all documents are suspect, whether they come from a police officer, a politician, a fireman, whether they come from an archive or they were recorded by a court or recorded by any institute that records people's experiences. And we have to treat them all as suspect. We have to take from them what we can and treat them carefully for what they tell us and what they don't, what is accurate about them and what isn't. And so my point of view is not only to use testimonies, but to use them as part of a much larger fabric of history and to correlate them with all the other available documentation. And I think the testimonies and other personal accounts are particularly useful if you try to focus on one place, because then you can have a critical mass of voices and a critical mass of documents, and you can carefully judge what happened, but also, from my point of view, more importantly, how different people saw and understood what was happening.
So this is really it. This is what the anatomy of genocide is all about. Is up until now, when historians described the events of the Second World War, they were too focused on what happened rather than what people felt and how they estimated the situation, which is the layer that you wish to bring to the debate?
Yes, to a certain extent. There has been, by and large, a tendency to try to reconstruct, if we talk about this particular genocide, the Holocaust, to try and reconstruct it on the basis of official documentation. That official documentation was produced by the perpetrators. They gave orders, they counted people, they organized the entire apparatus, right, of genocide. And these are very useful documents, but they don't tell you much, A, about how the victims experience this event, and B, they miss out on many things that happened that the perpetrators were not at all interested in. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to create a multidimensional picture of what happens in genocide, as in what happens in any other historical event, you should try to use all the available documents and not privilege one type over another, particularly not privilege those of the perpetrators.
Is this where Holocaust scholarship is going in general, to have a more rounded description of that specific historical event?
Well, this is one direction. I mean, I think scholarship on the genocide of the Jews, on the Holocaust, has gone in a variety of ways, but it has evolved from the original scholarship that was largely based on official documentation, German documentation. And this is one direction, that is to also listen to the voices of the people who were being persecuted and killed. That has to do also with the fact that there's been a growing recognition that the Holocaust happened in Eastern Europe, because most of the Jews lived there and most of the Jews were killed there. And most of the killing was going on there. And once you understand that, then you also understand that it was not only a relationship between perpetrators and victims, but that there was a social, cultural, political reality in the place before the Germans arrived, and that to understand what occurred, it's not only important to listen to the victims, it's important to listen to all the people who were there, who facilitated, viewed, observed, and participated in one way or another in this event. Yeah. That too has been missing from the literature.
Because you say, and I quote here, that the category of bystander in these areas was largely meaningless. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, it's actually quite simple. If you think of your neighborhood, wherever you may live, and you think that one day the police disappears, or the law enforcement agencies that you rely on are gone, and that some kind of violence begins, one group is being targeted, and you think you live in a 4-story house, and the family on the 4th story is taken out of the house and led through the street, and either they're shot right there on the street, or they're taken to a nearby hill or river and shot there, and you can hear the shots. And now there's an empty apartment on the 4th floor, and you know the people living on the 3rd floor may fancy that apartment. But you know this family, and you know they have a nice pot, they have a nice piano, they have a nice duvet, and you think, well, if I don't go there, then somebody else will go there. And also the air is much better on the 4th floor than on the 1st floor, so you may move in. Now, does that make you a bystander because you were watching through the window as the family was killed? Does that make you a collaborator? After all, you didn't hurt anybody, but you did move into their apartment. And so now you have a vested interest in what is going on around you. So in a small town, when a group of people is being killed on a regular basis as a kind of daily routine, everybody becomes a participant. Some people help, some people collaborate, some people just earn something out of it, but everyone is part of this event. Nobody is just standing and watching.
What is the story of Buczacz? It's today in present-day Ukraine, but in the interwar period it was a Polish town. Can you take us through the history of Buczacz before and during the Second World War, and tell us why you chose to focus it in particular?
So the reason that I did this book was that I was interested in the question of the encounter between killers and their victims. And that had to do with the fact that there was a certain assumption that in order to perpetrate genocide, you have to dehumanize your victims. And I think that's partly true, and it's true that in the Holocaust there was also an attempt to do precisely that. The creation of the death camps the extermination camps was part of that idea of distancing between the killers and the killed. But the truth of the matter is that about half of the victims of the Holocaust and many victims of many other genocides were killed one-on-one. And when you shoot people in the head, you tend to also encounter them first. There is some kind of exchange between two human beings. And I was interested in how does that work? So I wanted to see that on a local level in one town. How does it happen in one town? What actually occurs when the killers come? And so I had to choose a town. And I thought I'll choose a town in Eastern Europe because in Eastern Europe there were many towns in which much of the population was Jewish. I chose Buczacz for really two reasons. One is that I knew something about it because a famous Israeli author, a Hebrew language author who became an Israeli, came from it, Yosef Shmuel Agnon, Shai Agnon, who happens to have been also the only Nobel Prize winner in literature who wrote in Hebrew. And he wrote a great deal about Buczacz, and I studied in Israel in high school, so I knew some of his writings. And the second reason was that my mother came from that town too. And I thought, well, I might as well take Buczacz because I actually didn't know much about the town or even about my own mother's childhood. So I started off by asking my mother about her childhood. This is how I began the story. And then I realized that if you really want to understand what happens in a town like this, you can't start at the end. You can't start at the moment that the Germans come and start killing the Jews. You have to start much earlier on because that town was, the Jews called it a shtetl, right? And when Jews say shtetl, they mean a Jewish town. But there were actually no shtetls in the sense that they were purely Jewish towns anywhere. All towns had other people. It's just that the Poles thought that it was a Polish town, the Ukrainians thought it was a Ukrainian town, and the Jews said it was a shtetl. So I thought, well, let's see how these people lived with each other before all of that, which may inform us as to how they behaved when the violence began. And so in my conceit, I decided to begin at the very beginning, not at the end. That is, when this town was formed. And the first document on this town dates to 1260. It's not much after 1260, but if you go back to the 17th century, there's already a great deal. So this was a town in which Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, although they were not called that at the time, lived side by side since the 1500s at least. It was in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was a borderland town, so it was on the sort of margins of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1772, it became part of the territory of Poland that was annexed by the Austrian Habsburg Empire and part of what then became Galicia, which was a name invented for this region by the Austrians. And so it was under Austrian rule from 1772 until the end of World War I. And in 1918, when the Austrian Empire collapsed, it became part of newly reconstructed Poland. Poland had disappeared at the late 18th century and was resurrected after World War I. And it was a town in eastern Poland between 1918 and 1939. In 1939, it was occupied by the Red Army. Part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, the pact, was to divide Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. So this town was under Soviet rule from 1939 to 1941. And then from 41 to 44, it was under German rule. Mm-hmm. And during that time, two important things happened. One was that the Jews were murdered, the vast majority of the Jews in Buczacz and in the rest of Eastern Galicia, as it was known then, or District Galician, as the Germans called it. And second, that the Polish population was largely ethnically cleansed by Ukrainian nationalists. And then in 1944, the Soviet Union came back, and it was under part of the Soviet Union until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now it's in independent Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So when you're saying that you were looking at the story before its end,
yes.
What was the situation up until 1941 when the Nazis actually came and started killing Jews en masse? What can you tell us about the dynamic well into the Second World War already?
So this is the complicated story. There were obviously three distinct groups living in that town and in this region. And each of them had its own story to tell, had its own narrative about what it was, where it came from, why it was there, and how it related to the other groups. The Poles saw themselves as those who brought culture to these wild lands of the East. This was the Polish Wild East. The Ukrainians, as they started creating a Ukrainian national identity, which only happens in the 19th century, go back already to the wars of the 17th century, to the Cossack uprising, and see themselves as the indigenous population that had been colonized by the Poles. And the Jews are seen, for the Poles, the Jews are very much those who work the economy of the towns, who lease estates, who make things run. from the point of view of the Ukrainians, they are seen as the servants of the Poles, those who actually are physically in the process of oppressing Ukrainians. And this goes back all the way to Khmelnytsky, to the 17th century. The Jews see themselves as those who actually run things. They run the economy, they bring their own culture, but they also have a certain view, which I always found interesting. They are of the place and they're not at the same time. So they're seen by others as nationalism starts congealing in the late 19th century. Poles and Ukrainians are fighting over this territory. Who does it belong to? Right? The Poles say, we bring to it culture, we are civilizing the place. The Ukrainians say, you're oppressing us and it's not your land, get out of here. The Jews don't claim the land. The Jews are seen both by Poles and by Ukrainians as not belonging. And the Jews themselves, in large part, see themselves as in transit. They're actually on the way elsewhere. Agnon writes about this. They were, so to speak, on the way back to Eretz Israel. But they stopped for a while in Polin, right? They stopped for a rest, 400 or 500 years. But they don't claim the place unless they want to become part of some other national narrative. And that the era of the beginning of Polish nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, is also, somewhat belatedly, the beginning of Zionism. And so, to some extent, each group is telling its own story. And that does not mean that there's violence. We have this notion of Eastern Europe being a place of a great deal of violence. But from the late 17th century, from the end of the 17th century, to World War I, in Eastern Galicia, in that area, in Buczacz itself, there's very little violence. But the narratives become, especially since the late 19th century, with the rise of nationalism, increasingly antagonistic. Now you don't only tell your tale and ignore the narratives of others, you tell your tale against others. You say, this is mine and not yours, I belong and you do not. And then comes World War I. And World War I, we think of World War I in terms of the Western Front and all the terrible destruction there. But World War I in the East is extremely brutal. And it is not only a war in which empires fight each other. It is a war in which different national groups are actually fighting for their own interests, not the interests of the empires that conscript them. The Poles are actually fighting to recreate Poland, although they may be in the uniform of the Austrian army. The Ukrainians are fighting to create an independent Ukraine. The only people who are, as they were called, Kaisertreu, who are loyal to the Kaiser, to the emperor, are the Jews, because they kind of know that national states won't be in their interest, which of course antagonizes the nationalists against them. And so the war brings in both a great deal of violence in general, just people viewing this violence everywhere. The pogroms in Buczacz itself by Cossacks who occupy this town twice, the mass rapes and killings and evictions of population. So people are exposed to a great deal of violence, and that itself has a brutalizing effect. But also the narrative that had been only spoken now is being played out. And when the war ends, formally, it continues. So in 1918, as I said, the Austrian Empire collapses, but the war, first there's a war between Poles and Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians take over, and then the Poles come back. Then there's a war between Poles and Ukrainians on the one side, and the Bolsheviks coming from Russia on the other side. And finally, in 1923, the Poles really establish their power, and they know that they have to oppress, to keep down Ukrainian nationalism, because the Ukrainians claim this is our country. In Galicia, the majority of the population is Ukrainian, not Polish. The Poles are actually a minority.
So the fact that Buczacz became part of the state, the Polish state, was seen as a tremendous victory by the Poles, wasn't it?
Not only Buczacz, yes, Buczacz, of course, and all of Galicia. Yeah. It is no longer called Galicia. It is now Eastern Lesser Poland. They divide it differently, but there is a growing, increasingly radical Ukrainian national movement. In 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists is established, which is a terrorist organization. It's an underground organization, and it's fighting against Polish rule, and its credo is to create a Pole-free and Jew-free Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Now, in 1939, this area is taken over by the Soviets. The Soviets have their own policy. The Soviets feel a strong need, first of all, to decapitate all groups. So they deport large numbers of Poles, the Polish intelligentsia, Polish national leaders, the Polish aristocracy. They are deported in very large numbers. Then they deport large numbers of Jews, whether they're Zionists, they don't like Zionists, and the Jewish social elite, factory owners, businessmen, they're either deported or marginalized. And then they start deporting Ukrainian nationalists who are strongly anti-Soviet as well.
To the east.
To the east. Mm-hmm. And as they're in the business of this third wave of deportations, the Germans attack. And so when the Germans come in July of 1941, as they move into Buczacz, early July, this is a time in which there has already been a huge amount of violence. There was World War I, there was resistance, Ukrainian resistance against Poles, and then a great deal of police brutality by the Poles, and then the Soviets for 2 years exerting a huge amount of violence against the population, which ends with the killing of thousands of mostly Ukrainian political prisoners in local prisons, including in nearby towns near Buczacz.
And all that time, when they were wedged between the two empires, between the Nazis and the Soviets, did they continue, I'm talking about the Poles and the Ukrainians, did they continue to trade blows, or the situation changed radically because they were now, overrun by these two?
No, what is so interesting is that there is a competition of victimhood even at that time. So that the Poles say, we were the main victims of Soviet rule. The Jews were collaborating with the Bolsheviks. The Ukrainians were with the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks were saying they're like us, they're basically Russians, right? The Ukrainians say, we were being suppressed by the Soviets. We wanted an independent Ukraine, and the Soviets were killing us in large numbers toward the end. And the Jews, in fact, numerically, the Jews were deported proportionately in larger numbers than either Poles or Ukrainians. But the Jews also have a higher representation initially within the Soviet Secret Service, within the Soviet apparatus, and people would never seen Jews as policemen, for instance, suddenly see Jews walking down the street in a policeman's uniform and say, what is this? The Jews have taken over. So all three groups see this period as a period in which they were victimized, and not only were they victimized, their loss was somebody else's gain, and the gain is their neighbors, their Ukrainian neighbors, Jewish neighbors, Polish neighbors. That's when the Germans come in, and the Germans immediately activate this animus that exists within the population.
If I may go out on a limb here and suggest perhaps a counterfactual prospect, that if it hadn't been for that great implication of the Nazis and the Bolsheviks in that part of Europe, the Jews would have the upper hand, as it were, because the Poles and the Ukrainians would just victimize each other, turn against each other, and the Jews would be let off the hook in a way, because of the Soviet implication and then the Nazi implication that led ultimately to the mass killing. The Jews were, at the end of the day, the ultimate victims.
Well, that's historically it didn't work that way. To speculate about what might have happened is a bit difficult, but one can say one thing. That under German rule, we have this idea, okay, the Germans came and they started killing the Jews. And many Ukrainians were collaborating in that, particularly Ukrainian police battalions that were greatly helping the Germans, who were very thin on the ground, to carry out genocide. But there was something else going on there. At least from 1943, there's increasing violence between Poles and Ukrainians, which is entirely independent of the Germans. The Germans couldn't care less about it. And this is a war between Poles and Ukrainians over this territory. And the Ukrainians who become more powerful in that area actually empty the area in large part of the Polish population. They are carrying out the idea of creating a Jew-free and Pole-free Ukraine. Now, you have to remember that in the 1920s and 30s under Polish rule, the growing narrative within Polish political circles, in Warsaw, not just in Galicia, is that there are too many Jews in Poland and that we have to solve the Jewish question. The dynamic in Poland before the war, right, before the Soviets and the Germans invade Poland, is, for instance, maybe the Jews should be sent to Madagascar, which is later taken up by the Germans, but that's a Polish idea. How the Poles would have gotten the Jews to Madagascar is never explained, but the idea is that there are too many Jews. And certainly from 1935, after the death of Piłsudski, who was the sort of great leader of interwar Poland, and whom the Jews saw as friendly to the Jews, the right wing in Poland becomes increasingly more powerful, and official and unofficial anti-Semitism is growing. So the Jews were on the way out. Now, it doesn't mean that they would have been murdered so systematically. Obviously, the Germans were necessary for that. But the Jews had no place in that area, both from the Polish and from the Ukrainian perspective.
Sure, but when you have to prioritize your effort and your hate, didn't, if you look at it from a Polish perspective, didn't the Ukrainians pose a greater threat to their identity and their national aspirations than the Jews?
No, it's actually quite interesting. I mean, unlike the Ukrainians speak of themselves as having been colonized by the Poles. The Poles have a very different narrative about Ukrainians, or rather about what they call Ruthenians. That's the Ukrainians of Western Ukraine or Eastern Poland. They say these people are actually Poles, because they're the majority. So they're not about evicting the majority out of an area which is minority Polish. All they need to do is to persuade the Ruthenians that they're actually Poles. This is a project that you see happening from the late 19th century, even before Poland is created, in gymnasia, in the media, in newspapers. The Poles say the Ukrainians are really our little brothers. They speak a dialect that's very close to us. They're Christian. Okay, we are Roman Catholic. They're Greek Catholic. There is a great deal, one has to know, a great deal of intermarriage between Poles and Ukrainians in that area. And so in a sense, the Poles are not about getting rid of the Ukrainians. They're about Polonizing them. And the Ukrainian national movement is very much opposed to that, and they want to Ruthenize or Ukrainianize that area and kick the Poles out. So it is not a matter of priorities in that sense. The Jews are not a main issue, because the Jews are a small minority. But in the Polish ideology, national ideology, again, going back to the 19th century, they are an issue that has to be solved.
Mm-hmm. And then the Nazis storm in and basically destroy everything, right? All this pretty delicate balance or dynamic that you just described now didn't survive the Nazi occupation at all.
Yes, and ironically, the result is that the combined Soviet and Nazi occupation, Soviet deportations in 1939-41, German extermination of the Jews, Ukrainian ethnic cleansing, and then Soviet population policies after 1944 create what the nationalists always wanted. That is, homogeneous areas, ethnically homogeneous areas. That had never existed before there. There was never such a thing. Poland now is ethnically homogeneous. Western Ukraine is ethnically homogeneous. And that was created courtesy of the Nazis and the Soviets.
That's very nice of them. All right, Professor Omer Bartov, Professor of European History at Brown University and the author of the forthcoming book Anatomy of Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz, which will be out in January next year. Yep. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shendlin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, visit our website, like us on Facebook. Page is called The Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of The Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.